Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Asphodelos, the Third Circle Savage. This is the third Savage raid encounter made available in the Pandemonium raid series in Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker. This guide will blaze your trail to victory and have you screeching with exaltation. My name is Miztech and I'll be your raid guide. Scorched Exaltation will deal high raid-wide damage, mitigate and heal as necessary. Heat of Condemnation will target 2 random players with these tethers before hitting them for massive damage. The 2 tanks will need to each intercept a tether and move them away from the rest of the group to take the damage with cooldowns and without overlap. The tethers can be tricky to pick up, so I recommend that both tanks wait in the center of the boss until they each have picked up their tether before moving out to spread. Next up, Experimental FIREPLUME will form one of 2 AoE circle pattern attacks, depending on the visual telegraph over the boss's body at the end of the cast. If you see a ton of orbs around the boss, the raid can expect a rotating pattern of circles around the arena that starts in a random area, before one final hit in the very center. If you see a large orb on the boss, a massive circle attack will target a random player. To handle this without running out of room, we have the raid stacked slightly off-center for every experimental FIREPLUME cast, in case it forms the single orb attack pattern. This will ensure that the massive circle is baited slightly off-center away from the boss, allowing players to easily dodge the attack while also maintaining uptime. A quick note about baiting this way: if the rotating circle pattern appears at the end of the cast, players can quickly adjust into the exact center of the room to await the first set of circles. Once they see where the circles begin, they can immediately dodge into the area of the second set to easily avoid getting hit by any of the attacks. Immediately after the FIREPLUME's resolve, the boss will cast either left or right CINDERWING. This is a half-room cleave on the side of the boss indicated by the cast, and players will need to immediately reposition on the opposite side of the boss to avoid getting hit. Next, we reposition the boss in the center of the room to prepare for Darkened Fire. This mechanic will target all tanks and healers or all damage dealers with a Darkened Fire add. If these adds spawn too close to each other, they will tether, explode, and you will die. To prevent this, we partner up a tank or healer with 1 damage dealer and assign each pair a waymarker to drop their Darkened Fires at. We use the intercardinal waymarks at max melee to maintain uptime and avoid death. The Darkened Fire adds will spawn invulnerable and can be ignored for now. The raid can now loosely spread as the boss will soon mark up all players from 1 to 8. These numbers indicate the order each player will be targeted by Brightened Fire, a large AoE circle attack that will deal high damage and afflict anyone hit with a 4-second fire resist down debuff. This attack will also remove 1 stack of invulnerability from any Darkened Fire adds it hits. Due to the timing of each Brightened Fire attack and the resultant player debuffs, and the idea that you want to use these attacks to render the adds vulnerable, all players will need to carefully position themselves in between 2 adds based on their number. Again, we use the waymarkers placed at the boss's cardinal points at max melee range so everyone can maintain uptime during this time. Players 1 and 5 will stand at the north waymarker. Players 2 and 6 will stand at the east. Players 3 and 7 will stand south, and players 4 and 8 will stand west. The boss will then attack each player in turn, and by the time it makes a full circle, player debuffs will have fallen off for the next set of attacks. Additionally, once each add is hit by 2 Brightened Fires, they will become vulnerable to damage, and players will have to quickly destroy them before they cast Darkened Blaze, or you will probably die. Next up, players can reposition behind the boss to allow the tanks to easily pick up the next set of tethers for another Heat of Condemnation double tank buster. This is immediately followed by another Scorched Exaltation raid-wide blast. The boss will then cast Devouring Brand, and fire lines will form in a cross-shaped pattern at the outer edge and begin to move in to divide the arena. As these lines are forming, the boss will cast another Experimental FIREPLUME. Players will again bait this attack south of the center to give them plenty of time to dodge whatever version of the mechanic is incoming. If it's the single massive plume, all players can quickly move into the northwest quadrant to avoid the attack. If it's the rotating pattern, players can move into either the northwest or northeast quadrant, whichever one the attack goes off in first. Once in the save quadrant, players will need to stack together for Searing Breeze, which will place circle AoEs under all players. Since there's limited room available to dodge in this quadrant, baiting the circle attacks together will allow plenty of room for the raid to dodge into. Immediately after, the boss will cast left or right CINDERWING, and all players will need to move to the opposite side of the boss to avoid getting hit. Around this time, the Devouring Brand fire lines will also disappear. After this, the group can reposition in the center to allow each tank to pick up the next Heat of Condemnation tether tank busters. The boss will then cast another Experimental FIREPLUME, and the group will stand in the center to bait. Once the cast goes off, adjust as necessary to dodge the incoming pattern. As this pattern is resolving, the boss will fly away and reappear somewhere along the outer edge of the arena. The boss will soon fly across the arena from this position, and depending on which heads are glowing, players can expect a specific combo of mechanics. If the middle head is glowing, players will need to move out of the center to avoid the dive. As the boss is diving, all players will be targeted with Flare of Condemnation circle attacks that deal high damage and debuffs. To avoid avoid overlap, each player is assigned a specific spread position to the relative left or right of the boss during this pattern. If the two outer heads are glowing, players will need to move into the center to avoid the two incoming side dives. For this dive, all tanks and healers or all damage dealers will be targeted by Trail of Condemnation circle attacks that must be shared with another person to survive. To handle this, we use the same pairings from Dark and Fire and assign a position for each pair in the center to avoid overlap. The boss will then return to the center of the arena but remain invulnerable. Blazing Rain will periodically deal raid-wide damage during this phase. Healers be ready. 4 adds will spawn around the boss that must be picked up immediately by the tanks. All of these adds must be destroyed before they enrage or you will die. They must also be killed far enough away from each other, as the boss will soon cast Flames of Undeath, dealing high raid-wide damage and resurrecting each add. If the adds are too close when they resurrect, they will buff each other and the boss, and you will probably die. These new adds will maintain their enmity, so tanks don't have to worry too much about picking them up immediately. All players will then be targeted with either 1 or 2 proximity-based tethers. Players targeted with 2 tethers will be tethered to an add and another player. Players with 1 tether will only be targeted to another player. Each of these tethers must be pulled far away from their sources until the tether turns purple to signify enough distance between the two. These tethers also indicate the path that each bird will soon dive on, targeting their tethered players and anyone hit on the way with high damage and debuffs. The goal of this mechanic is to allow the sunbirds to do their dives without overlapping or killing anyone in the process. To handle this, all players with the double tether must quickly identify which add they are tethered to and immediately move to the opposite side of that add. Players with the single tether must quickly identify which player they are attached to and move to the opposite side of them. In most cases, the single player will end up near the sunbird attached to their partner, so they can also use the bird tethered to their friend as an indicator of where to stand. All players will also need to make sure they're not too close to anyone else before the birds begin to dive, since the width of each bird dive is much wider than the tethers themselves. As such, any player with a double tether will need to sidestep away from the direction of their second tether after the first bird dive to avoid getting clipped by the second dive. After each bird dives twice, the adds can then be pulled into the center for a few hits of AoE, before the tanks pull them back out to separate them before death. The raid will again have before the adds cast their enrage to destroy each one, or you will die. Once all of the adds are destroyed, the boss will again cast Flames of Undeath. This time, the adds will be resurrected into these eldritch horrors and join up with the boss for the remainder of the encounter. The boss will then cast Dead Rebirth, dealing massive raid-wide damage. Shield and heal through this blast as necessary. From here on out, the 4 adds will deal some pretty nasty auto attack damage to the second enmity target, and both tanks need to ensure that they are top 1 and 2 on enmity for the rest of the encounter. The group can stack behind the boss here to allow the tanks to quickly pick up the next set of Heat of Condemnation tankbuster tethers. Next up, Fledgling Flight will target either the tanks and healers or all of the damage dealers with these directional markers. Each affected player will need to move to the edge of the boss that allows them to point their marker outwards, as they will soon drop down an add that will blast in the same direction as that initial arrow marker. As soon as the markers disappear and the adds come down, all players can then move into the boss to avoid getting hit. The boss will then cast Experimental GLORYPLUME. This time, 2 plume indicators will form over the boss at the end of the cast, and as such, 2 attacks will be associated with the cast. For this particular cast, players can always expect the rotating plume pattern, followed by a dark version of either the big orb or multiple orb indicator. This will indicate whether players will need to stack or spread after dodging the initial rotation pattern. To handle this, we have the players bait the initial rotating pattern in the middle. We then split the group in 2, with one group dodging into the available safe area in the north, while the other dodges into the available safe area in the south. As they dodge the initial rotating pattern, each group will then stack together or spread apart as necessary. This attack deals really high damage even when handled properly, so healers be ready. Next up, we bring the boss back into the middle to prepare for Fountain of Fire. This will cause sets of circles to spawn on the outer edge of the platform that will tether to the boss. If these fountain tethers are not intercepted, the boss will be buffed and you will probably die. The 2 healers will be assigned to stand in each of these fountains to intercept the tethers. Doing so will deal them high damage, but also significantly buff their healing for the duration of their Trickle of Fire debuff. At the same time, the 2 closest players to the boss will be targeted for Sun's Pinion, indicated by these large pink circles around them. These players will soon spawn bird adds that will deal damage and debuffs as they spawn, and link to them with proximity-based damage tethers. Affected players will need to run opposite the arena to their birds to reduce damage. The tether dives do not stop at their targets and instead will continue through them all the way across the arena, and all other players will need to move away from the tether dive area to avoid getting hit. To control where these dives happen, we assign 2 players to bait each round of pinions by standing closest to the boss. They will then bring their circles close to the edge of the Fountain of Fire circles to drop off their birds. As soon as their birds spawn, they can move to the opposite side of the arena until their tethers turn purple. Once there, they should also sidestep slightly to avoid getting run over by their partner's bird opposite opposite them. As they're doing this, the second and third pairs will bait and drop their birds in the same manner, and all players will need to be careful not to stand on or near any tethers to avoid getting hit by extra dives. Once all of the pinion dives and fountains are resolved, the boss will cast another 2 Scorched Exaltations, dealing high raid-wide damage. This is followed by another set of Heat of Condemnation Tankbuster tethers. Next up, the boss will move to the center and face south before casting FIRESTORMS of Asphodelos. This will deal raid-wide damage and spawn 3 fire tornadoes around the room. The boss will also deal periodic raid damage during this phase. Flames of Asphodelos will throw out 3 sets of bowtie-shaped AoEs that will explode in the order that they spawn in. Players can stand in the third AoE while the first one explodes before moving into that area to dodge the other 2. While these are going out, the boss will also cast experimental ASHPLUME, and players will have to pay attention to the orb indicator that will appear over the boss at the end of the cast and be ready to either stack or spread. To handle this combo, we have the group split in half again, with one group dodging the flame bowties around the north while the other group dodges the bowties around the south. As soon as they dodge the flames, each group will either stack or spread to take the ASHPLUME before returning to the boss. Immediately after, another set of Flames of Asphodelos bowties will spawn and players will need to dodge them in the same manner. As these flame attacks resolve, the boss will cast Storms of Asphodelos, and 2 Tankbuster tethers will appear on random players. The 2 tanks will need to each grab one and move it away from the group. At the same time, the boss and each of the tornadoes around the outer edge will throw out cleave attacks towards the 3 closest players to them. All of these mechanics will apply fire resist down debuffs and cannot be overlapped. There are a number of ways to handle this glut of mechanics, and I'll quickly go over the 2 most common ways you'll see. The first is having the tanks use their immunities to take the 2 tethers while also baiting the 2 southern tornadoes and acting as 2 of the proximity targets to the boss. One ranged player will be assigned to baiting the north tornado away from the group, while the group stacks up with one of the players baiting the 3rd proximity cleave from the boss. This method calls for some very specific positioning and may require a bit of practice to get just right, as one false move will probably wipe the entire group. The second method is a little safer, and missteps are likely to only kill the erring player, but there is a bit more downtime involved for everyone. In this method, we assign 3 players to each tornado, baiting in specific directions so as to not overlap each other or the center. The 2 tanks will handle their tethers far from the group, while the remaining 3 players will remain close to the boss to bait out the proximity cleaves to the east, west, and south in between the tornadoes and tanks. I would recommend playing to your group's strengths here when choosing a strat for this mechanic. It's pretty deep into the fight, and wiping here can really suck, so be careful. Next up, the boss will cast DARKBLAZE Twister. This will tether 2 tornadoes with orange tethers and 1 with a dark tether. The dark twister will deal a knockback at the end of its cast, while the orange burning twisters will explode in room-wide donut attacks immediately after. As these twister attacks are being cast, the boss will target the raid with 4 sets of Searing Breeze ground circles. To handle this combo, players will need to quickly identify the dark twister and stack in front of it to begin baiting Searing Breeze. As soon as the first circles drop under the group, they will begin to rotate clockwise until all 4 sets have dropped in a controlled manner. The boss is also casting experimental ASHPLUME during this time, and players will have to pay attention to the spread or stack indicator that will appear over the boss as they rotate. This movement will have the group ending roughly in front of the dark twister as its cast is about to finish. The raid will then split in half again and pre-position for the knockback from the dark twister, with one group aiming themselves towards the twister to the relative left, while the other group aims themselves to the twister on the relative right. After the knockback occurs, all players will need to wait close to their orange twister for the donut attack to resolve before spreading or stacking for the previously indicated ASHPLUME as needed. All of this is immediately followed by another Scorched Exaltation raid-wide blast, and healers will have to be ready to top everyone off before it goes off. With this cast, the boss will also stop casting Blazing Rain and the twisters will disappear. Next up, the boss will cast Death's Toll, and players will be afflicted with either a single stack, a 2 stack, or 4 stack of the debuff. With this debuff, anytime a player takes lethal damage, a stack will be removed. Immediately after, the boss will cast Fledgling Flight, and 4 players will be targeted by the directional arrows again. This time, all affected players must aim their arrows towards the center. This will create specific lethal areas with enough overlap to satisfy the removal requirement of each debuff stack. Players with single stacks will stand at max melee at the cardinals. Doing so will have them only getting hit by the bird blast across from them. Players with the 2 stack will stand at max melee at an intercardinal. This will have them getting hit by 2 of the blasts. Finally, players with the 4 stack will need to stand directly in the middle to get hit by all 4 birds. When this debuff is removed by lethal damage, the player will also be afflicted with an HP recovery down debuff, making it quite difficult for healers to top everyone off before the boss casts Life's Agonies, which will deal high raid-wide damage. Depending on your group's comp, you may need to use a healer LB3 to ensure all players are topped off in time. In our group, we use a strategic Macrocosmos and save LB3 for damage. Next up, the boss will cast Experimental GLORYPLUME. This cast is always the baited massive plume, and we have the group stacked together in the center during the cast before immediately splitting into their groups north and south to dodge the next attack. As you're dodging the baited plume, watch for the incoming pattern indicator over the boss and immediately spread or stack as necessary. The boss will again disappear and reappear somewhere at the edge of the platform to dive across. Players will need to identify the glowing heads and spread to the outsides or stack with their partner in the center lane during the dive bomb. The boss will return to the platform and cast Devouring Brand and Experimental Fireplume. This combo is identical to the combo at the beginning of the fight and can be handled in the exact same manner. Bait the Fireplume and then dodge towards the north as a group. Stack up to bait the Searing Breeze circles and adjust to the left or right of Cinderwing. The boss will then cast 2 Scorched Exaltations before the final Exaltation and Rage cast. You'll need to destroy the boss before this time or you will die. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we're heading into the first part of the 4th Circle Savage. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.